Hey there and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to do something different. We're going to talk about Canada. Well, it's not that different actually. We're still talking about a country, its history, where it came from, how it got to be the way it is today. But this time, instead of me telling you about the country, I want you to tell me about the country. So leave a comment below with whatever you think you know about Canada. Now without further ado, let's go back to the beginning. Canada, famed for its maple syrup, hockey legends like Wayne Gretzky, and breathtaking wilderness, is the second largest country on Earth. Home to 20% of the world's freshwater lakes. For millennia, indigenous peoples like the Inuit, Haida, and Cree thrived here, building resilient societies adapted to harsh winters. Now there are two main theories about how the very first people populated the Americas. You can check out my video about those theories right here if you're interested. But either way, thousands of years ago, these people began migrating south down the coast of what is now Canada into the United States. Some of these groups eventually made their way into Central and South America. Other groups stayed in Canada and became known as the First Nations, which includes hundreds of tribes like the Inuit, the Cree, and the Mohawk. Most of these groups spoke different languages, but some, like the Iroquoian nations, would go on to have a profound impact on the future of the continent. And they would first come into contact with Europeans in the early 1500s, when explorers from England, France, and Spain began searching for new trade routes and lands to claim for their countries. And this brings us to our first point of the timeline. Early European contact. Roughly 1000 AD, Vikings established a short-lived settlement at Meadows in Newfoundland. Now the first confirmed European foothold in the Americas. Now there have been some recent developments surrounding the authenticity of Meadows, so more research is being done. But for the purposes of this video, we'll continue with the story as though it were authentic. About 500 years later, an Italian explorer named John Cabot reached Newfoundland while sailing for England. Both the Vikings and the English claimed these lands for their countries. Although the native people were never displaced or wiped out, unlike what happened in most of the rest of the Americas. Still, life in Canada was hard, and many of the settlers died due to the harsh climate. But the English continued to send ships over to try their luck. And in 1608, French explorer Jacques Cartier claimed the Gulf of St. Lawrence for France, naming the area Canada, derived from the local Iroquoian word Canada, meaning village. The following year, Cartier returned to Canada and established a settlement near present-day Montreal. Though his colony was abandoned, this marked the start of European colonization in Canada. Over the next few decades, both France and England would establish colonies in Canada and fight over control of the region. In fact, the rivalry between them would last for more than 100 years. This brings us to our next point on the timeline: colonial rivalries, 1600s. France founded Quebec City in 1608 and Montreal in 1642, while England established fur trading posts around Hudson Bay. Now, these posts were often short-lived because conditions were so harsh. But both France and England had a vested interest in this land, and so they kept trying. Eventually, the struggle for power in Canada escalated into a series of conflicts between the colonial rivals and their respective Indigenous allies, such as the Iroquois Confederacy and the Huron-Wendat. These rivalries were exacerbated by the lucrative fur trade, which created tensions and alliances that would have lasting impacts on the region. During this time, the French were generally more accepting of the various cultures that existed in North America, whereas the English were less so. This led to the French being more successful in forming alliances with various Native American nations. However, despite these advantages, the French were ultimately defeated by the British in the 7 Years' War, which took place between 1756 and 1763. And that brings us to our next point on the timeline. In 1759, during the height of the 7 Years' War, British forces under the command of James Wolfe captured Quebec City, marking a turning point in the struggle for North American dominance. Though fierce battles continued, France's hold on Canada weakened significantly. On September 8, 1763, following years of conflict and recognizing their inability to retain Canada, France officially surrendered their North American territories to Britain, through the Treaty of Paris ending any hopes they had of maintaining a colonial presence in the region. Following the end of the war, the victorious British began to assert greater control over Canada. And this brings us to our next point on the timeline. From colonies to nationhood in 1774, the Quebec Act, a piece of legislation passed by the British Parliament aimed at addressing the concerns of French Canadians by preserving their language, culture, and Catholicism, which helped ease tensions and resentment among the Francophone population. But it also left the door open for the United States to absorb French Canada, something they attempted to do in 1812. And that brings us to our next point on the timeline, 1812 to 1815. The War of 1812. A conflict between the United States and Britain that arose from unresolved issues stemming from the War of 1812. The Northwest Territory and maritime disputes. Tensions escalated, leading the United States to declare war on June 1812. Despite early American successes, British forces aided by First Nations allies turned the tide. Battles like the defense of Fort McHenry, which inspired the writing of the U.S. national anthem, and the pivotal victory at the Battle of Queenston Heights solidified Canadian resistance. Key figures like Isaac Brock and Loris Secord became symbols of patriotism. By 1814, peace negotiations commenced, resulting in the Treaty of Ghent in December 1814, which restored pre-war boundaries and emphasized Canadian autonomy, laying the groundwork for the formation of a distinct Canadian identity. This solidified Canada's borders and spurred the rise of Canadian nationalism. But internal tensions remained between the English and French-speaking Canadians. In response to the rebellions, Britain passed the Act of Union in 1840, uniting Upper and Lower Canada into the Province of Canada, a significant step towards a unified Canadian identity. The Act aimed to stabilize the colony by merging the two regions, creating a more balanced representation and potentially reducing tensions. However, it also contributed to growing political divisions between French and English Canadians, which persisted for decades. Responsible government was finally achieved in 1848, marking a crucial shift towards self-governance. As Canada progressed, the call for further expansion and national unity grew. And this brings us to our next point on the timeline, 1867. On July 1st, 1867, the British North America Act united the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick into the Dominion of Canada, with Ottawa as its capital, marking a significant step towards Canadian independence. This act laid the foundation for Canada's political structure, including a federal system with provincial autonomy and the establishment of a Canadian Parliament. In the years following Confederation, Canada experienced significant territorial expansion, incorporating new provinces like Manitoba in 1870, British Columbia in 1871, Alberta and Saskatchewan in 1905. These expansions were driven by the desire for resources and the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885, a monumental achievement that linked the nation coast to coast, but which also displaced many Indigenous peoples who were forced to move on to reservations. This brings us to our next point on the timeline. Leader Louis Riel played a significant role in advocating for the rights and interests of French-speaking Canadians, particularly the people. His actions were rooted in the belief that these communities needed greater political and economic representation. Riel emerged as a prominent figure during the Red River and Northwest rebellions, which aimed to secure autonomy and protect the rights of French-speaking Canadians in the face of British policies that they perceived as marginalizing. However, his approach to achieving these goals was controversial, including calls for independence and provisional governments. Ultimately, Riel's execution in 1885 deepened the divide between French-speaking and English-speaking Canadians and left a lasting impact on the country's political landscape. During this period, Canada also witnessed a massive wave of immigration, transforming the prairies into a global breadbasket. Between 1896 and 1914, more than 3.5 million immigrants, primarily from Britain, Ireland, and Asia, arrived in Canada, contributing to its agricultural prosperity and economic growth. This influx of settlers played a crucial role in shaping Canada's social and cultural diversity. And this brings us to our next point on the timeline. Entering the 20th century. Canada's entry into the 20th century was marked by its participation in major global conflicts, including the First and Second World Wars. During World War I, over 600,000 Canadians served, with battles like Vimy Ridge becoming iconic moments of national pride and remembrance. Similarly, Canada's involvement in World War II saw over 1.1 million Canadians serve, contributing significantly to the Allied war effort. These experiences of combat and sacrifice played a pivotal role in shaping Canadian identity and its place on the world stage. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster granted Canada full legal independence from Britain, marking a significant milestone in its journey towards sovereignty. This act formally recognized Canada's right to self-governance and legislative autonomy, allowing it to pass laws independent of British authority. It was a symbolic and legal step that reinforced Canada's position as a free and independent nation on the global stage. After achieving independence, Canada continued to evolve. And this brings us to our next point on the timeline, the 1960s. The Quiet Revolution was a period of rapid social, political, and economic change in French Canada during the 1960s. It was a transformative era that challenged traditional values and institutions, leading to significant reforms in areas such as language, culture, and education. Spearheaded by intellectuals, politicians, and activists, the Quiet Revolution aimed to modernize French Canada and assert its distinctiveness within a broader Canadian context. Key figures like Premier Maurice Duplessis and Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson played pivotal roles in navigating this era of change, balancing the need for modernization with the desire to preserve cultural heritage. Tensions between French-speaking Quebecers and English-speaking Canadians continued to simmer throughout the latter half of the 20th century. And this brings us to our next point on the timeline, 1982. In 1982, Canada patriated its constitution, enshrining the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a landmark achievement that affirmed Canada's commitment to fundamental rights and freedoms for all citizens. This move symbolized Canada's journey towards full sovereignty and its dedication to upholding democratic principles. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees fundamental rights and freedoms in areas such as language, religion, and expression, serving as a cornerstone of Canada's commitment to justice and equality. Since 1982, Canada has continued to evolve and face new challenges. And this brings us to our next point on the timeline. Modern Canada, 1982, present. In the late 1980s, the failure of the Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accords, which aimed to address Quebec's sovereignty and Aboriginal rights, reignited debates surrounding Canada's national identity and unity. The Meech Lake Accord, negotiated in 1988, sought to recognize Quebec's distinct society status and enhance Aboriginal participation in politics. However, it faced opposition and was ultimately rejected, contributing to a growing sense of alienation in Quebec. The Charlottetown Accord, signed in 1992, attempted to resolve outstanding constitutional issues, but it too was defeated in a national referendum, highlighting the complexities of Canadian federalism and the enduring challenges of achieving national unity. Despite these setbacks, Canada continued to progress. In 1995, Quebec's bid for independence was narrowly defeated in a referendum, marking a significant moment in Canadian unity. The referendum, which saw a 50.58% vote,